Next, from the University of Illinois at Springfield, we hear author Michael Burlingame talk about the political climate that existed as Abraham Lincoln became president in 1861. Mr. Burlingame, who wrote a 2,000-page biography of President Lincoln, tells us how Lincoln established his leadership in the early days of his presidency. This runs about 40 minutes.
Well, as Lucas mentioned, he teaches at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, and he shows a lot of courage to be teaching Lincoln in that realm because that's where Lee is buried, that's where Stonewall Jackson is buried. And when you go to Lexington, one of the things that you really have to see is the burial site of Lee's horse, Traveler. And it's a flat stone, flat with the ground, and people come and they put carrots and apples and other things on there that horses might like. And they also put coins, including some pennies. But if you look closely, you'll see that all the pennies are turned over so that Lincoln's face doesn't show. But Lucas and his children go and they flip the coins over so Lincoln's face does show. That takes a lot of courage. And speaking of bumper stickers you see in Lexington, Virginia, pro-Confederate, I recently saw one here in Springfield that showed a Confederate flag and the motto, "Fighting Terrorism Since 1861." And I felt like stopping the driver and saying, well, what about 1866, 67, 68, when the Ku Klux Klan was engaged in the greatest terrorist acts in American history? But I refrained from asking that question. And I'd like to thank, too, as Lucas and Cullum pointed out, that Barbara Ferrara has really been an absolute champ in making this series work as well as it does. So I think we really have to give her a round of applause. Well, my theme tonight is implied in the title, Lincoln is the Indispensable Man. That Lincoln's leadership was really the crucial variable that made the difference between victory and defeat in the Civil War. Now, at first blush, you might say, well, now wait a minute, wasn't the North's victory preordained? Didn't the North have a more substantial population? Didn't it have a more economically developed industrial base than the South? Wasn't the North's victory inevitable? Well, no, it wasn't. In fact, if a reasonable oddsmaker had been alive on April 12, 1861, as he received news that Fort Sumter had been bombarded and the Civil War was about to begin, he probably would have given the South at least an equal chance of winning and probably favored the South. As a very fine historian, William Hanchett, has written, contrary to the conventional assumption, the North, not the South, was the underdog in the Civil War. Now, the fact that the North was more populous, that had a more developed economy, hardly means that victory was inevitable. Smaller nations have been known to defeat larger nations in war. The United States, or the United Colonies, fighting for independence against the most formidable power in Europe, Great Britain, won that war. The Dutch won a similar war of independence against the Spanish. North Vietnam won a war against the United States. So it's not inevitable that the side with the largest armies wins. And think for a minute some of the advantages that the South had. In order to win the war, the South didn't have to conquer the North. It just had to fend the North off. And it was a lot easier to do that than to go and conquer and to occupy. Another advantage that the South enjoyed is that the Southerners would know the terrain upon which the battles would be fought. Oh, and by the way, I recently read a commentary by a park ranger at one of the battlefield parks, Shiloh, I think it was, and he said, you know, you get the funniest questions from tourists coming around to these sites. And one of them asked me the other day, how is it that so many Civil War battles took place in national parks? And there's a story that a guide in Gettysburg was taking some people from California around the battlefield, and they said, well, if there was such a big battle here, why aren't some of these monuments dinged up? And, you know, yeah, what can I tell you? Anyway, so the South had the tremendous advantage of knowing the terrain. The Southern young men were more used to living outdoors, to riding, to using firearms than Northern young men. Southern military leadership was superior because the South was a traditional society in which the warrior class was much more highly regarded than it was in the North, where young men who wanted to aspire to high positions that commanded social respect would go into commerce rather than to the military. So military leadership was superior in the South. Other considerations which may have made a difference that an odds maker would have to take into account in April of 1861 is that European powers would probably intervene on behalf of the South. The industrial economies of France and Britain depended upon American cotton. American cotton in those days was the equivalent of Middle East oil today. So it seemed perfectly understandable and reasonable that the South would, and an odds maker would consider that the British and the French would intervene on behalf of the South, and it would make the victory of the North almost impossible. And that's how the American colonists basically won their independence, with the French intervention, which made it possible for the British to be defeated. So another consideration is military technology. There are periods in wartime when the technology favors the offense. Then there are periods in war when the military technology favors the defense. And the American Civil War was one of those periods when the defense was favored because of the widespread adoption of rifles rather than muskets. Rifles were much more accurate and had much greater range than muskets. So if you were fighting on the defense, you had a great advantage. You could start picking off people charging you at a much greater distance than you could earlier during, say, the Napoleonic Wars. Many considerations then suggest that the South stood at least an equal chance, and probably odds makers would have given the odds favorable to the South. Another thing to bear in mind, to conduct an enormous enterprise like the American Civil War required a governmental large-scale structure that could mobilize men and resources effectively. And in April of 1861, the small and creaky bureaucratic structures of the federal government didn't fit that description. And the civilian sector of the northern economy didn't have large-scale enterprises other than railroads. So all these things combined, I think, would make it seem reasonable that the South stood a greater chance of winning than the North. And the greatest threat that the North faced was disunity. The challenge of getting slaveholders in Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland and Delaware to cooperate with abolitionists from New Hampshire and Massachusetts and Connecticut was a great challenge. How do you get people, racists in New England, to cooperate with slaveholders in the border states? How do you get free traders to cooperate with protectionists? How do you get people who had been Whigs to cooperate with former Democrats? That would be like getting people, Red Sox fans and Yankee fans, to cooperate with each other. That has more resonance in New England, I guess, than it does here. In any event, the divisions within the North were profound, and getting all these various factions to cooperate with each other was a major challenge. And therefore, it seems entirely reasonable to concur with Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, who after the war said this: "No people ever warred for independence with more relative advantages than the Confederates." Years after the war, he recalled that Confederates were, in one sentiment as in territory, starting out not with a struggling administration of doubtful authority, but with our ancient state governments and a fully organized central government. At the beginning of the conflict, the South, he said, with its great material resources, its defensive means of mountains, rivers, railroads, and telegraph, with the immense advantage of interior lines of war, was well positioned to win. And those interior lines were important. It's easier for the Confederates to move their forces around to repel northern invaders than it was northerners to move their forces to attack. So, what was then the key variable that made victory possible? Well, I'm not the only historian to make this argument. In fact, it has a long provenance, that Lincoln was the critical variable. A century ago, the leading historian of the Civil War era, James Ford Rhodes, concluded that, quote, "the preponderating asset of the North proved to be Lincoln." A generation after that, James G. Randall, who was the premier Lincoln scholar of his time, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and he taught for many years at the satellite campus over in Champaign-Urbana. And he wrote a 4-volume study called Lincoln the President, and he argued that it's doubtful whether any other leader of the North could have matched Lincoln in dramatizing the war to the popular mind, in shaping language to his purpose, in smoothing domestic and international complications, in courageously persisting in the face of almost unendurable discouragements, in maintaining war morale while refusing to harbor personal malice against the South. In 1960, a leading Civil War historian, David M. Potter, the author of Lincoln and His Party and the Secession Crisis, and then the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Impending Crisis, speculated that it hardly seems unrealistic to suppose that if the Union and the Confederacy had exchanged presidents with one another, that is, Jefferson Davis had been president of the North and Lincoln had been president of the South, the Confederacy might well have won its independence. And there's, I think, a lot of truth in that. The contrast between the leadership of Jefferson Davis and Lincoln was indeed profound. As the leading Civil War historian of our era, James McPherson, has argued, there is a broad consensus that Lincoln was more eloquent than Davis in expressing war aims, more successful in communicating with the people, more skillful as a political leader in keeping factions working together for the war effort, better able to endure criticism and work with his critics to achieve a common goal. And indeed, the personality differences between Lincoln and Jefferson Davis were profound. Davis was a thin-skinned gentleman, like many politicians are very thin-skinned. All of us tend to have needy egos, but people in politics and show business tend to have especially needy egos. And as you probably heard, politics is sometimes referred to as show business for ugly people. So Davis was a sort of a typical, or more than typical politician. He was very thin-skinned, took criticism personally, bore grudges, and quarreled. He quarreled with his vice president. He quarreled with his Congress. He quarreled with his governors. He quarreled with his editors. He quarreled with his generals. And that rather prickly, contentious, disputatious character of Jefferson Davis undermined the Confederate war effort. Lincoln, on the other hand, managed to overcome the petty tyranny of his own ego and to achieve a level of psychological maturity and balance unparalleled in the history of American public life. He refused to take criticism personally. He refused to quarrel. He refused to argue. He refused to be upset by snubs. And if he didn't have that capacity, that character, it's entirely conceivable that the North could not have maintained its unity and would not have been able to win the war. He demonstrated enormous self-control in tolerating the snubs of condescending generals like George B. McClellan, about whom more later. The hostile machinations of contemptuous cabinet members like Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury. The haughtiness of senators like Charles Sumner. The insults of political opponents like Maryland Congressman Henry Winter Davis. The savage cries of Democratic newspapers like Marcus Brick Pomeroy, who called for his assassination. And the patronizing attitude of Republican editors who kept second-guessing him, like Horace Greeley of the influential New York Tribune. Now, I can't go into detail with all these characters. It's in my book, Abraham Lincoln, A Life. You can read it about it at your leisure. But what I'll just give you one example. I'd like to go with one example tonight, and that is, well, two examples, actually. Lincoln's dealings with George McClellan first. No one tested Lincoln's forbearance more severely than McClellan, who in private, in letters to his wife, said this about Lincoln: he's an idiot. He's the original gorilla. He's a baboon. He's an old stick, and a pretty poor timber at that. McClellan criticized the cowardice of President Lincoln and insisted, I can never regard him with feeling other than those of thorough contempt for his mind, his heart, and his morality. Come on, George, what do you really think? Am I right? McClellan's contempt for Lincoln was partly rooted in social snobbery. Lincoln was from hardscrabble poverty and the frontier of Kentucky and Indiana. George McClellan was the scion of a prominent Philadelphia surgeon and very conscious of his social status. And this contempt led McClellan not only to write letters to his wife in which he badmouthed the president, but also to treat Lincoln to his face with contempt. In November 1861, this is very shortly after McClellan is named the commander of all the Union armies, the general returned to his house one evening where he found the president's secretary, John Hay, and the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, waiting for him. And Hay noted in his diary that night that McClellan, quote, without paying any particular attention to the porter who told him that the president was waiting to see him, the general went upstairs, passing the door of the room where the president and Secretary of State were seated. They waited about half an hour and sent once more a servant to tell the general that they were there, and the answer came back that the general had gone to bed. En route back to the White House, John Hay condemned this unparalleled insolence of epaulets, as he put it. But Lincoln, according to Hay's diary, seemed not to have noticed it specially, saying it was better at this time not to be making points of etiquette and personal dignity. Well, I think any of us who had been in that position would have fired him, right? Well, this snub was not unprecedented. A month earlier, the English journalist William Howard Russell noted in his diary, calling on the general, that is McClellan, the other night, at his usual time of return, I was told by the orderly, who was closing the door, that the general's gone to bed tired and can see no one. He sent the same message to the president, who came inquiring after him 10 minutes ago. Around this same time, Lincoln called at the general's headquarters, only to be told that he's lying down, very much fatigued. On another occasion, McClellan did not deign to interrupt his breakfast when the president called. Lincoln was kept waiting till the general finished eating, much to the surprise of an observer. Admiral David D. Porter was astounded when a conversation he was having with the general concerning the New Orleans campaign, their conversation was interrupted by a servant announcing that the president wished to see McClellan. Let him wait, came the reply. I'm busy. Oh, remarked Porter, don't send such a message to the president. He's very much interested in this matter, as you might imagine. And it's not respectful to keep him waiting. Remember that he is our commander-in-chief. Well, said McClellan, let the commander-in-chief wait. He has no business to know what's going on. In December 1861, Lincoln asked McClellan to see Colonel Rush Hawkins about a matter, and the general refused. When Colonel Hawkins complained to a cabinet member about the general's unwillingness to honor a presidential request, the cabinet member assured him that such behavior by the general was common. Several months later, Lincoln once again found McClellan unwilling to get out of bed to meet with him. The president called at the general's house one Sunday morning in September 1862 and asked to see him. A short while later, McClellan's chief of staff and also his son-in-law, General Randolph Marcy, quote, came down and with a flushed face and confused manner said he was very sorry, but McClellan was not yet up. A strange expression came over Lincoln's face as he rose and said, of course, he's very busy now and no doubt was laboring far into the night, and he departed hastily. A similar act of rudeness occurred when McClellan failed to keep an appointment with the president and a general and the governor of Ohio. After a long wait, Lincoln said with customary magnanimity and forbearance, "Never mind, I will hold McClellan's horse if he will only bring us success." And this is one of those anecdotes that speaks volumes. What really counted was success in the war. And if I have to put up with a general who's going to treat me shabbily, I don't care as long as he can give us victories. Now, in early 1862, McClellan stood up not only the president, but the entire cabinet. As the president told General Ambrose E. Burnside that February, McClellan, Lincoln said, "is a good fellow and he means well, but he don't know so much about etiquette as I do." And this is a quote from Lincoln being quoted by Burnside. And Lincoln says, "I asked McClellan to come and meet the cabinet in consultation the other day, and he promised to do so. I called the cabinet together at noon, and all of them came, but no McClellan. At noon, Secretary Seward got impatient and went away. And at 1 o'clock, all the others were gone. At 1:30, McClellan walks in, and I asked him why he wasn't here. And he said that he had forgotten the appointed time." Well, this absent-mindedness reminded Lincoln of one of his legal cases. And he tells Burnside this: "When I was practicing law in Illinois, a bad fellow in our town was charged with rape. He was accused of having committed 2 outrages on the woman, one in the afternoon and the other the next day. Everybody believed him guilty, and when he applied to me to defend him, I refused, but he pled so hard and assured me so positively that the woman was a willing party that I consented to defend him and took up the cause. At the trial, the woman gave an excellent direct testimony. I saw its effect on the jury and that it might be overcome. And in the cross-examination, I led her off to other topics and then suddenly returned to the charge." And Lincoln then says, "This is what I said to the woman on the stand. I said, 'Did you sleep with your husband after the first outrage?' And she said, 'Yes.' And then Lincoln said, 'Did you tell him about it?' And she said, 'No, I forgot.'" So this is McClellan, "I forgot." It's some excuse. And yet, McClellan goes on to even more outrageous conduct, and this is the most outrageous in my view. After the failure of the Peninsular Campaign, a huge effort is made in the spring of 1861. McClellan has this gigantic army. He takes it down almost to the gates of Richmond and is driven off by Lee. And it's a bad defeat. Lincoln's very dismayed, as is the whole North. And here's what McClellan sends in the way of a telegram to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. "I have lost this battle because my force was too small. I am not responsible for this." He closed with a remarkably insubordinate blast. "If I save this army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or to any other persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army." So he's accused, this is to the Secretary of War, and by implication the President as well. Well, the telegraph operator who received this excised those 2 sentences, didn't even show them to Stanton. Even so, Stanton was enraged, and he goes to Lincoln and says, "You know, Mr. President, that all I have done was by your authority." And Lincoln says, "Yeah, that's right." Lincoln magnanimously overlooked McClellan's insolence and tried to calm him down. "Save your army at all events," he wired in response to McClellan's frantic telegram. "We will send enforcements as soon as we can." And yet, so McClellan is eventually replaced, in effect, by John Pope shortly after the failure of the Peninsular Campaign. Pope is a tremendous failure. Then the question was, who is going to be reappointed or appointed to head the army? Pope's a failure. And Lincoln chooses McClellan. His cabinet is up in arms. They're saying, this guy doesn't have what it takes. His heart's not in it. He doesn't have the steely determination necessary to win battles. And Lincoln says, look, our army is demoralized. Nobody can restore the morale of the army better than McClellan. And even though he's treated me shabbily and us shabbily, he's the man for the hour, and we're going to reappoint him. And that was one of the hardest decisions Lincoln ever had to make. But it's an example of his magnanimity, his willingness to overlook snubs, insults, shabby treatment, not to take that personally. One other example I'd like to share with you is his decision, one of his best decisions, which was to appoint Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War in January of 1862 to replace the inept and incompetent Simon Cameron. And politically, it looked like a shrewd move. Cameron was from Pennsylvania. Stanton's from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a very important state. You have to have it in the cabinet. Stanton was a former Democrat. Cameron was a former Democrat. You need former Democrats as well as former Whigs to keep the Republican Party united. Stanton had worked in the Buchanan administration as a cabinet member. Therefore, he had Democratic cabinet creds. And so Lincoln appoints him, even though Stanton had treated Lincoln with the utmost contempt several years earlier when they were both involved in a patent case in Cincinnati. Very important patent case. Let me fill in that background a little bit. When he appointed Stanton, he consulted several people before making the appointment, and one of the persons that he appointed, that he consulted with, was a Philadelphia lawyer who had been part of the team that had cooperated with Lincoln and Stanton in the case that I mentioned earlier in 1855. So he asked George Harding, the Philadelphia patent attorney whom he had gotten to know in that 1855 trial, who do you think, Harding, I should appoint as Secretary of War? Harding replied, I have in mind only one man, but I know you could not and would not appoint him after the outrageous way he insulted you and behaved toward you in the patent case. Oh, replied Lincoln, you mean Stanton. Now, Mr. Harding, this is not a personal matter. I simply want to do what is best for the country. And let me just tell you a little bit about the insults that were heaped upon Lincoln by Stanton in 1855 when they were both serving as lawyers in this very important patent case. In 1855, Lincoln had been hired to help argue a high-stakes patent case. The McCormick Reaper Company sued the John H. Manny Company of Rockford, Illinois, for infringing its patent. Because the case was originally scheduled to be tried here in Illinois before Judge Thomas Drummond, Manny hired Lincoln as associate counsel, paying him a retainer of $1,000 to keep McCormick from employing him. When a new judge was assigned to the case, the trial was moved to Cincinnati. Lincoln worked diligently on a brief for Manny, who had hired Stanton and Harding to be his lead attorneys. When Lincoln arrived in Cincinnati, he was surprised to learn that he would not help present the argument. He was surprised to learn that this was the case. The sophisticated Stanton and Harding were taken aback when they first beheld their unprepossessing co-counsel, Lincoln, whose clothes fit him badly. After being introduced, Lincoln suggested that they proceed to court in a gang. Stanton drew Harding aside and said, let that fellow go with his gang. We'll walk up together alone. And so they did, snubbing Lincoln. And at the courthouse, Stanton emphatically announced that only he and Harding would be arguing their client's case. And throughout the trial, Harding and Stanton continued to ignore their associate Lincoln. When Lincoln had a copy of his elaborate argument presented to Harding, the Philadelphia attorney returned it unopened. Harding remembered that in all his experience, he had never seen one man insult another man more grossly, and that too without reason, than Stanton insulted Lincoln on that occasion. Stanton conducted himself toward Lincoln in such a way that it was evident that he, Stanton, thought Lincoln was of no importance and deserved no consideration whatsoever from himself, and he refused to talk with him and told Harding that it was shameful that such a low-down country lawyer should be sent to associate with them. Stanton refused to walk with Lincoln or be seen on the street with him. In court, Stanton refused to talk with or say anything to Lincoln, but utterly ignored him, even refusing to take from Lincoln's hands one of the models used in the case. Stanton referred to Lincoln as a giraffe and a long-armed baboon, and he once rudely jerked Lincoln by the coattails and told him to step aside as lawyers examined the reapers on display. Lincoln understandably felt badly treated and humiliated, and he was so deeply disappointed that as he left Cincinnati, he said to his hostess, well, the woman at whose house he'd been staying, "You have made my stay here most agreeable, and I am 1,000 times obliged to you. But in reply to your request for me to come again, I must say to you, I never expect to be in Cincinnati again." I have nothing against the city, but things have happened here as to make it undesirable for me ever to return to this city. So he was deeply wounded, obviously. And yet he appointed Stanton to this cabinet, and Stanton turned out to be one of his most brilliant appointments, and perhaps the most brilliant appointment he made. So, now Lincoln refused to quarrel, refused to hold grudges because, as one of his closest friends put it, he managed his politics upon a plan entirely different from any other man in the country. In his conduct of the war, he acted on the theory that but one thing was necessary, and that was a united North. He had all the shades of sentiments and opinions to deal with, and the consideration was always presented to his mind, how can I hold these discordant elements together? And Lincoln was one of those rare men who can not only give good advice, but act on it. And I'd like to close with one of my favorite quotes from Lincoln, that is a letter that he writes to a young Union captain who was squabbling with his superior officers during the war. And in October of 1863, he takes time from his busy schedule to give this young man a piece of wise paternal advice. And in doing so, he quotes from one of his favorite authors, Shakespeare, from one of his favorite plays, Hamlet, and quotes from Polonius' speech to Laertes, in which old chestnuts like neither a borrower nor a lender be until thine own self be true, or interlarded. But he quotes another passage. And Lincoln says to this young man, the advice of a father to his son, and then he quotes from Polonius' speech to Laertes, beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. That advice, Lincoln says, is good and yet not the best. Quarrel not at all. No man determined to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiating of his temper and the loss of self-control. Yield greater things to which you can show no more than an equal claim, and lesser things, though clearly your own. Better to give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite. Thank you.
An interesting comparison there. So obviously it leads to my question, how would each of you compare Lincoln's public policy making with his public oratory?
Public policy making. Well, I would say the following, and this is what I'm in the habit of saying to my students when I lead them in my fall seminar, which I'm doing now, on Lincoln statesmanship. Lincoln was at pains prior to becoming president, but especially as president, to point to standards by which his own actions should be judged, and principally that was the standard of the Constitution. And so I would say in sum that Lincoln used his words in a way that would grease the skids, as it were, of the policies that he tried to enact. And he did this most especially when he was preparing the nation to receive what would become the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Michael mentioned this famous disagreement that Lincoln had with Horace Greeley. And Greeley writes, makes a public letter, right? The prayer of 20 millions. You can say something like that if you're the editor of a paper. Prayer of 20 millions, where he lambasts Lincoln for not enforcing the Confiscation Acts. This is August 19th, I think, of '62. Lincoln responds in a public letter, not in the Tribune, but in another paper, and not directly to Greeley, but it's clear he's responding to Greeley. And in this letter, he talks about the purposes of the war. All the while, already having a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in his pocket. It's a draft that he doesn't produce until a month later after the Battle of Antietam. And so what does he do? With Greeley in this public letter, and several times earlier in that year, Lincoln uses his words to help bring the nation up to speed, as it were, on the subject of emancipation, and in particular on its constitutionality, something Lincoln is unclear he has the power to do as president, but finally comes to see that he has this authority under the Constitution, but he needs to prepare the people to receive it. And as it were, he launches these trial balloons that year to get them ready for its reception. So I would say that that Lincoln at least attempted, and to his success I leave the historians to judge, but at least Lincoln at least attempted to use his words as a public official to help prepare public opinion to receive policies that they might not think or receive as readily without it.
Well, I second those thoughts, and would like to say that there are a number of elements to Lincoln's leadership above and beyond the emphasis on character and magnanimity and forbearance that I emphasized heavily tonight. In the interest of time, I cut this paragraph, which I would like to share with you now in this context. As president, Lincoln succeeded not only because he had developed an extraordinarily high level of psychological maturity and consciousness and balance. In addition, he was able to lead the North to victory for other reasons that time does not permit us to investigate this evening. And these are some of those reasons. He somehow managed to be strong-willed without being willful, moral without being moralistic, and righteous without being self-righteous. He inspired confidence and affection. He had a preternatural understanding of public opinion. His sense of political timing was exquisite. He managed to infuse into the Northern public his own indomitable will and determination to win the war. He masterfully kept the Republican Party, and by extension the North itself, unified. And he was supremely eloquent in articulating the aims of the war. Without those qualities, he would have failed, the North would have lost the war, slavery would have long persisted, and the cause of democracy in the world would have been set back dramatically. So eloquence was certainly an element of his successful leadership, to be sure.
Thank you to both of you. You have managed very politely to point out how simplistic my question was.
No, it's very
So I appreciate that. We have some early returns coming in. I want to know if there's someone in our audience here who has comments or a question. Yes, sir.
How involved was Lincoln in keeping the European powers out of intervening in the war?
I will repeat the question, which was nicely put. How active was Lincoln in dealing with the diverse interests and demands of the European powers? Is that a fair restatement?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, Lincoln, when he became president, acknowledged to his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, that, look, I don't know much about foreign affairs, and you are a very accomplished and widely traveled and knowledgeable fellow, and so I'm going to leave the conduct of foreign affairs largely in your hands. And Seward was a very effective Secretary of State. His one flaw, which could have caused trouble, was that he tended to be a little hot-tempered. And after the English, in the spring of 1861, declare that the Confederacy shall be acknowledged as a neutral power, as a belligerent, Seward was furious, although the British really had to make that statement, given the fact that the Union had declared a blockade. And so Seward writes this blistering letter to America's ambassador, or minister as they called them in those days, to England, Charles Francis Adams, in which he denounces the British and threatens to go to war with them. And Lincoln gets a hold of this document and tones it way down, and then also concludes by saying, this is not to be read to the British foreign minister. And so Lincoln acted as a brake on Seward's impulsiveness, and he was to some extent that way with Stanton. When Stanton was first appointed, somebody came to him and said, well, you know, Mr. President, he's awfully impulsive. And Lincoln says, well, he reminds me of an old Methodist preacher who was known to be pretty impulsive and dramatic in the pulpit. And they just put bricks in his pocket to keep him. So we'll put some bricks in Stanton's pocket. And he also put some bricks in Seward's pocket.
I don't have anything to add to that. I thought that was aptly answered. I would add this, though, on the question of other characteristics of Lincoln, especially that we'd all do well to imitate. I wrote down integrity. In the summer of 1864, Lincoln does not believe he's going to be reelected as late as early August. In fact, he meets with the cabinet, I think, in July, and basically has them sign that what's it called? Something memorandum. Do you remember this? There's a term for this. At any rate,
the blind memorandum?
Yes.
Right.
Well, anyway, in that summer, he doesn't think he's going to be reelected. He thinks McClellan will, and he thinks the Emancipation Proclamation is going to go out the window. And so what he does is on two separate occasions, once with Martin Delany and once with Frederick Douglass. This is the second time he meets with Frederick Douglass. But these two leading black political activists of the Civil War era, Lincoln meets with them privately. And he says to them, I don't think I'm going to be reelected. And so I need your help. What I need you to do is figure out a way to get past Confederate lines and spirit as many slaves as you can into Union camps. Because once I'm out of office, all bets are off. Once I'm out of office, you know full well what McClellan will do is declare an armistice, and that will be the end of the emancipation of slaves in this country. And so here's what Lincoln is doing, trying to make good on what some people, like Lerone Bennett, claim were these fatuous attempts at freeing slaves. Here is Lincoln making good on his commitment to emancipation, doing so all the while thinking he's not going to be reelected. And so while he is president, trying to follow through on that commitment to emancipation. So integrity, I think, is one characteristic I associate with Lincoln.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.